At the edge of the lake where they said my son had his accident, I saw my daughter-in-law, Cynthia, throw a locked suitcase into the water. The thump it made sounded so final. But what I pulled from that freezing water wasn't just her secret, it was the real reason my son had to die. And that's where it all began. Everything I thought I knew about my son, about this family, it all shattered right there at the water's edge. Hello everyone, my name is Frank. Thank you for listening. I'm telling this story from my little woodshop out behind the house. It's about the only place I feel any peace anymore. I know a lot of you guys, my friends and brothers, are listening in. Do me a favor and drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from. It helps to know I'm not alone in all this. It all started on an afternoon in October, the kind of day when the chill starts to seep right through the wood planks and into the bones of an old man like me. I'd gone down to the lake where they found Leo's truck, just looking for a bit of quiet, a place to think. But instead, I found a truth I don't think any man is ever ready to face. The lake that day was still, like a broken mirror reflecting a gray, unforgiving sky. I was just going to sit on that old wooden bench where Leo and I used to fish, the one we built together one Saturday years ago. I just wanted to watch the water and try to piece together the good memories, push out the bad ones. But then I saw her car, Cynthia's shiny black SUV, the one she was so proud of, parked near a stand of birch trees. And then I saw her, a small, determined figure, wrestling something out of the back. It was an old travel suitcase, a hard-shell type, scuffed at the corners. That struck me as odd. Cynthia never used anything that wasn't brand new. She dragged it to the edge of the water, her breath coming out in white puffs in the cold air. I watched her from behind an old oak, my heart starting to beat in a way that had nothing to do with grief. It was a different rhythm, a low drumbeat of alarm, the kind of feeling you get on a construction site right before a heavy storm rolls in, a deep, unnatural quiet. She didn't hesitate for a second. With a strength I didn't know she had, she heaved the suitcase up and swung it out over the water. There was no sound but a heavy, sickening thump as it broke the calm surface and sank fast. That sound, it drilled itself into my mind. It was cold, efficient, and final. Afterward, she just stood there for a moment, brushing her hands on her expensive coat like she'd just tossed out a bag of trash. Then she turned, got back in her car, and drove away. She left me alone with the lake, its surface still rippling out in fading circles. For a split second, my mind tried to make sense of it, to find an innocent explanation. Maybe it was full of Leo's things, painful memories she couldn't bear to look at. But my gut told me otherwise. The way she did it, that chilling lack of emotion, that wasn't a person in mourning. That was a person burying a crime. I didn't think. I just moved. I scrambled down the steep, muddy bank, my knees groaning in protest. The October water was a shock, a brutal, biting cold that soaked through my Levi's and my old Merrill work boots in an instant. The cold clenched my chest, stealing my breath. I waded out, my feet sinking into the soft mud, my eyes scanning the dark water where the last ripples had disappeared. And then I saw it, a dark shape suspended just below the surface. Getting a grip on it was one thing, moving it was another. It was heavier than I could have imagined, a dead, uncooperative weight. As I heaved, a sharp, familiar pain shot up my spine. This was the same back that had framed 100 houses, that had carried beams and lifted trusses without complaint for 40 years. Now, it was screaming at me. Every inch I dragged that suitcase towards the shore was a bitter reminder that I was 68 years old. My breath came in ragged, burning gasps. The water, the weight, the pain. For the first time in a long, long time, I felt physically helpless, a feeling I hate more than anything. Finally, with one last desperate pull, I got it onto the soggy grass. The case was locked tight with a combination lock. I didn't have time to guess. I always keep a full Craftsman tool set in my truck, a habit from my contracting days. I ran, my waterlogged boots feeling like lead weights, and grabbed a hammer and a pry bar. My heart was pounding against my ribs, a frantic prisoner. Back at the suitcase, I jammed the pry bar into the seam and hammered it. The lock snapped with a dry, cracking sound. I threw the lid open. Inside, nestled among old, threadbare blankets, was a newborn baby. Its skin was a terrifying shade of purple, its tiny body almost perfectly still. Its lips were blue, its eyes were closed. For one long second, my world just stopped turning. The chill from the lake was nothing compared to the ice that flooded my veins right then. I've seen a lot in my life, accidents on job sites, friends I've lost, but nothing, absolutely nothing prepared me for this. My hands trembled as I lifted the tiny body out. It was so cold. I tore off my Carhartt jacket, the one that's seen me through 30 winters, and wrapped the baby in it, trying to force my own warmth into that little frame. I pressed my ear to its chest. A heartbeat. Faint. Fluttery. But it was there. I started rubbing its back, my rough hands clumsy and frantic. I breathed gently onto its face, doing anything I could think of. And then a sound, a tiny, weak whimper. It grew into a thin, reedy cry that tore through the quiet of the dying afternoon. In all my life, I've never heard a sound so tragic and so beautiful. It wasn't just the cry of a baby. It was the cry of a life that refused to be thrown away. And in that moment, holding my son's child, I knew my quiet retirement was over. A different kind of work had just begun. Holding that baby, I knew every second counted. I ran back to the house, the child still wrapped tightly in my coat, and fumbled for my phone to call 911. My voice was shaking, not from the cold anymore, but from a raw mixture of fury and fear that was churning in my gut. I tried to explain what happened, to be as clear as I could. Blackwood Lake, a baby in a suitcase, my daughter-in-law. The dispatcher on the other end kept telling me to calm down, to repeat myself. I could hear the skepticism in her voice, that carefully neutral tone people use when they think they're dealing with a confused old man. It was the first time my mind, my story, was put on trial. And that feeling was somehow worse than the bone-deep cold I was still shaking from. The ambulance and a police cruiser arrived at nearly the same time, lights flashing against the dark woods. The paramedics were professional, efficient. They took the baby, wrapping him in a thermal blanket, and just like that, he was gone. I was left standing there, dripping on my own porch, alone with the questions. The officer who spoke to me was Detective Fatima Salazar. She was young, with sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. She took out a small notebook and a pen. I told her everything, starting from the moment I saw Cynthia's SUV to the moment I pried open that lock. She listened intently, nodding now and then, but her eyes, they weren't the eyes of someone who believed me. They were the eyes of someone collecting data, looking for inconsistencies. "Mr. Miller," she said, her voice flat, "the report says you lost your son, Leo, just recently?" I nodded, my throat tight. "That's right." She scribbled something in her notebook. "Grief can do things to our memory, sir. It can make us see things that aren't there." The words hung in the air between us. It was like a slap in the face. She didn't see a witness. She didn't see a man who had just saved a life. She saw a grieving old father, a liability, someone who might be imagining things. I couldn't sleep that night. The house felt huge and empty, the silence pressing in on me. I sat in my old lazy boy recliner, my usual command center, but tonight it offered no comfort. I just stared at the photos on the fireplace mantel. There was one of Leo at his college graduation. My late wife and I standing on either side of him, grinning like fools. I remembered all the overtime shifts, the weekends I worked straight through, just so he could go to a good school, so he could have a better start than I did. I remembered the day he married Cynthia. I'd given them a good chunk of my savings, a real nest egg, to help them buy their first house. I gave them everything I could without a second thought. That's what a father does. And now this. The legacy of my son, his own flesh and blood, tossed in a lake like garbage by the woman he had loved. The pain of being betrayed felt sharper, deeper than the pain of losing him. It was a violation of everything we had built. The next morning, I was up before the sun. The hot anger of the night had burned down, leaving behind something colder, harder. Resolve. I wasn't just a grieving father anymore. I was a man with a job to do. I went out to my wood shop, the smell of sawdust and oil instantly calming my nerves. I didn't turn on the saw. I just started cleaning my DeWalt power tools, taking them down one by one. The methodical sweep of the oiled rag over cold steel helped me think. It was a familiar ritual, a way of bringing order to chaos. I didn't need their pity. At this point, I didn't even need them to believe me. I just needed the truth. And I realized, standing there in my sanctuary, that I was going to have to find it myself. Polishing the tools that had helped me build my life felt like I was getting ready to defend it. Detective Salazar called me back around noon. There was a new tone in her voice, something that sounded almost like satisfaction. "Mr. Miller, we spoke with Cynthia Miller," she said. "She has a confirmed alibi. She was at a charity fundraiser all afternoon. Dozens of witnesses place her there." She paused, letting the words sink in. "We also checked the security cameras on the main road leading to the lake. No vehicle matching her SUV's description entered or left the area during the time you mentioned." I stood there by the phone, silent. It was a perfect story, a perfect plan. Cynthia hadn't just gotten away with it. She had made me sound like a fool, a liar, or worse, a man who had lost his mind. Their official investigation, it seemed, was over before it ever really began. And I knew, in that moment, I was completely on my own. With the police having officially written me off as some confused old man, a loose end they'd neatly tied up, I knew with a gut-level certainty that I was on my own. If there were any answers to be found, I'd have to dig them up myself. The only logical place to start was Leo's old room, which he'd been using as a home office for the past couple of years. I hadn't set foot in there since the funeral. My wife and I had kept it as his sanctuary when he left for college, and even after he married, it was still his space. Pushing the door open, the old wood groaning softly, I was hit by the faint, familiar scent of him, a mix of old books and that cedarwood aftershave he always wore, the one my wife bought him every Christmas. A baseball trophy he'd won in high school still sat on his bookshelf, gathering a fine layer of dust. But something was deeply wrong. Everything was neat, clinically, terrifyingly neat. Files were stacked in perfect right angles on his desk. Pens stood at attention in a ceramic cup. Not a single speck of dust marred the monitor screen. This wasn't the organized chaos of the son I knew, a man who lived with a creative storm of papers and books around him. This was Cynthia's work. She had come in here and scrubbed him away, sanitized his memory, erased his very presence. I felt like a trespasser in my own house, a burglar sifting through the ashes of my son's life. I sat down heavily in his desk chair, the leather sighing under my weight as if it remembered him. I touched his computer, my fingers tracing the outline of the keyboard where his hands had been. I ran a hand over the cold, orderly stacks of paper. What was I even looking for? A misplaced receipt? A hidden letter? Honestly, I wasn't sure. I was just looking for a crack, one small hairline fracture in Cynthia's perfect porcelain facade. My head was spinning. I needed to talk to someone who wouldn't look at me like I was losing my mind, someone who knew me before I was just Leo's grieving father. I called Arthur, my best friend since our days sweating it out together in the Union. Artie's the kind of guy you can lay it all out for, no judgment, no fluff. We met at the old Silver Spoon Diner, the kind of place that's been there forever, with red vinyl booths and a pot of black coffee that's been brewing since dawn. The air smelled of bacon and real maple syrup. I watched him stir his coffee, the spoon clinking rhythmically against the thick ceramic mug. He's a big man, with hands calloused from a lifetime of hard work, but he was always gentle in his movements. I told him everything, my voice low, the words feeling heavy and strange in the cheerful morning bustle of the diner. I told him about the suitcase, the baby, the detective's dismissive tone. He just listened, his brow furrowed, his gaze never leaving my face. He wasn't surprised. "I told you, Frank," he finally said, his voice a low rumble that cut through the noise. "I never trusted that girl. The way she looked at Leo. It wasn't love. She looked at him like he was a winning lottery ticket." His words were a knife, but a necessary one, lancing a wound that needed to be cleaned. They gave voice to the ugly suspicions I'd been trying to bury for months. He told me to be careful. "People who are greedy for money, Frank, there's no line they won't cross," he said, looking me dead in the eye. "You need to look at his financials. That's where she'll have left her tracks. Follow the money." His words gave me a purpose, a direction. I went back to that sterile alien office, but this time I wasn't just searching blindly, I had a target. I started pulling out the files she'd so neatly arranged, bank statements, insurance policies, loan agreements. I'm the man who taught Leo how to balance a checkbook when he was 15, sitting right here at this kitchen table with a calculator and a pencil. Now, looking at these documents, I felt like a stranger to my own son's life. The numbers swam before my eyes, a language I no longer understood. There were large, regular wire transfers to an account I didn't recognize, some offshore holding company with a name that sounded fake. Leo's life insurance policy was for a staggering amount, a figure far beyond what a young man his age would normally have. And the sole beneficiary, named in cold, clear type, was Cynthia Miller. A wave of acidic nausea washed over me. My son, my boy, his life had been quantified, calculated, and turned into a dollar amount. And I, his father, the man who was supposed to teach him about the dangers of the world, had been completely, utterly blind to it all. The weight of that failure felt heavier than any beam I'd ever lifted. I was about to give up, my head pounding from staring at the spreadsheets, overwhelmed by the cold, hard numbers, when my eyes caught something out of place. It was almost nothing. Tucked behind a thick row of Civil War history books, Leo's favorite subject, was the spine of a small black moleskin notebook. Now, this was my Leo, messy, a constant note-taker, always hiding his most important thoughts in the most unlikely places. My hands trembled slightly as I pulled it free. The cover was soft and worn. This was his journal. The first few pages were full of a young man's hope, his boundless love for Cynthia, his giddy excitement about becoming a father, his plans for the future they were going to build. But as I read on, page by page, the tone began to change, slowly at first, then all at once. An entry from 3 months ago. "Cynthia asked about the insurance policy again, 3rd time this week, said she was just planning for the future." A month later. "She got angry when I said I wanted to set up a trust for the baby, said it felt like I didn't trust her." Then, just 2 weeks before the accident, the writing was tighter, the words more urgent. Met with the lawyer today, alone. I changed the primary beneficiary to my child effective immediately. Something doesn't feel right. The last entry was scribbled, the pen strokes so hard they'd torn the page, the words hurried and jagged. She knows. My God, she knows. The date beneath it was the day before they found his truck by the lake. I had to read it 3 times before the words would fully register, before my mind would allow them in. My breath caught in my chest, a painful, shallow gasp. The air in the room felt thick, unbreathable. This wasn't a guess. This wasn't a grieving father's paranoia. This was a voice from the grave. This was evidence. My son knew he was in danger. He had tried to protect his child the only way he knew how. And it had cost him his life. The suitcase, the baby, the insurance policy. All the pieces slammed into place, forming a picture so monstrous I could barely stand to look at it. Cynthia wasn't just a gold digger. She was a murderer, and I was holding my son's last will and testament in my hands. Clutching that journal like a holy relic, I knew this was bigger than me now. This wasn't a family dispute anymore. It was a homicide investigation that the police had refused to start. Arthur gave me the name of a lawyer, a woman named Maria Sanchez. Her office was a small, unassuming place in a brick building downtown, the kind you'd walk right past if you weren't looking for it. The place smelled of old books and strong coffee. She was in her 60s, with a full head of silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and eyes that seemed to see right through you, past all the nonsense. I laid everything out on her wide oak desk, the story, the bank statements, and finally, Leo's journal. She didn't interrupt me once. She read the journal slowly, her face unreadable, her finger tracing each line of my son's frantic handwriting. The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by the ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. When she finished, she closed the notebook gently and looked up at me. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I was met with an expression of complete and total belief. "Mr. Miller," she said, her voice firm and clear, without a hint of pity, "we have a case, a very strong one." The relief that washed over me was so powerful it almost brought me to my knees. It felt like I'd been holding my breath since I pulled that suitcase from the water, and I could finally exhale. While we had the journal, the baby was still in the NICU at the county hospital, a tiny warrior fighting in a plastic box listed on a chart as John Doe. Maria said our first, most critical step was proving paternity. She filed an emergency motion with the court to compel a DNA test. I went to the hospital that afternoon. The antiseptic smell, the quiet, urgent beeping of machines. It was another world. A nurse led me to a small, sterile room and took a simple cheek swab. It was over in minutes. Through the large glass window of the NICU, I saw him, my grandson, so impossibly small in that incubator. My heart clenched, my blood, Leo's blood, lying there all alone. All the legal battles, the papers, the evidence, it was all for him. I made a silent promise to Leo and to myself that I would not let anything happen to this child. He was all I had left of my son. A few days later, Maria called. I was in the workshop, trying to lose myself in the familiar work of sanding a piece of maple. "Frank, we got the results," she said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "It's 99.99%. That little boy is your grandson." I sat down hard on a nearby stool, the phone feeling heavy in my trembling hand. I'd known it in my bones, of course, but hearing it confirmed by science was different. It was a fact. It was ammunition. It made it real, undeniable. This boy, the child Cynthia had tried to discard, was Leo's legal heir. Maria explained this was the weapon we needed. It didn't just give me the legal standing to fight for custody, it shredded Cynthia's alibi. How could a woman have a rock-solid alibi for the very time her own newborn son was found half dead? The web of lies was starting to unravel. But that small, critical victory opened up a new front. The Department of Social Services sent a caseworker to my house, a young man named Davies, who couldn't have been more than 25, wearing an ill-fitting suit and carrying a clipboard like a shield. He walked through my home, the home I'd built with my own 2 hands, the home where I'd raised my son, making little notes with a pen that clicked annoyingly. "This house doesn't appear to be properly baby-proofed," he said, eyeing my tool bench in the corner with suspicion. "And we'll need to review your financial stability. Is your pension sufficient to provide for a child?" I felt the blood rush to my face, a hot, prickly anger. I've been paying my bills on time my whole life. I built this house from the foundation up, and now this kid, young enough to be my own son, was standing here questioning my ability to be a caregiver. It was a profound insult to everything I was. To satisfy their bureaucratic checklist, I had to make a significant withdrawal from my retirement savings, the money I'd put away for 40 years, for a rainy day. Well, it was pouring. I drove to Home Depot, a place that used to be my playground. But this time, I wasn't there for a new table saw or a router bit. I was in the aisles with the moms and dads, my big, clumsy hands fumbling with plastic packages of outlet plug covers, cabinet safety locks, and a goddamn baby gate. I spent the entire weekend transforming my home, my fortress, into a place that was suitable. Every plastic lock I installed, every screw I tightened felt like an admission of defeat. I was being forced to pay, out of my own pocket, to prove I was worthy of loving my own grandson. It was a quiet, grinding humiliation, another financial burden that Cynthia had indirectly, cruelly forced upon me. That feeling of having to use the money you saved your whole life for a peaceful retirement just to prove the obvious. It's hard to describe. A lot of us work our fingers to the bone for that security. Have you ever had to dip into those savings for an unexpected family duty that you never saw coming? Share your story in the comments. It helps to know we're not alone in these fights. In a small town, news travels fast. It doesn't ride on the wind. It gets carried from the checkout line at the grocery store to the pews on Sunday morning. My fight for Leo's son, backed by the undeniable truth of a DNA test, became the topic of quiet conversation over coffee and backyard fences. I had hoped this public knowledge would put pressure on Cynthia, maybe force her to show her hand. I should have known her hand would be holding a knife, sharpened and ready. One morning while I was rinsing my coffee pot in the kitchen sink, the phone rang, its shrill sound cutting through the quiet. I didn't recognize the number, but I answered it anyway, wiping my wet hands on my jeans. The voice on the other end was a ghost, a sound so unexpected it made the hair on my arm stand up. "Frank, it's me, Cynthia." Her voice was syrupy sweet, an artificial honey dripping with a concern that turned my stomach. It was the same voice she used at Christmas parties and family barbecues, the one expertly designed to charm and disarm. "I heard there's been some kind of terrible misunderstanding," she cooed, the sound tinny and false through the phone's speaker. "I'm so worried about you, Frank. Are you doing okay? Is there anything at all I can do to help?" The sheer, breathtaking audacity of it left me speechless. I stood there, gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white, the silence stretching between us. She was playing the part of the devoted, concerned daughter-in-law, the grieving widow, while I knew she was the one who had tossed my grandson into a freezing lake to die. She was a monster wearing a perfectly fitted mask of civility. "Frank, I know you're grieving," she continued, her voice dropping into a conspiratorial whisper, full of theatrical sympathy that felt like an insult. Losing Leo was a shock to all of us, and sometimes when we're in that much pain, our minds they can play tricks on us. Are you absolutely sure about what you think you saw that day? There it was. Not a direct accusation, not a scream or a curse, but something far more insidious. It was a seed of doubt, planted with surgical precision, designed not just for others, but for me. She wanted me to question my own sanity. She was trying to manipulate me, to turn my grief into a weapon against myself. Then the velvet glove came off. The police told me about your accusations. Her voice suddenly turned cold, hard, and flat. The artificial sweetness evaporated instantly, leaving behind the chill of steel. You're making a lot of trouble, Frank. For everyone. It would be better for you, for the memory of my husband, if you just dropped this. Retract your statement. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a threat, wrapped in the language of false concern. She didn't stop with a phone call. A quiet, deliberate campaign to poison the well began. I started to notice it in small ways, like stones skipping across the surface of my life, leaving ripples of unease. My neighbor Ed, who used to give a big wave from his lawnmower, now just stared straight ahead, suddenly fascinated by a patch of grass near his driveway when I went to get the mail. The woman at the post office, Brenda, who had known me for 30 years, suddenly couldn't quite meet my eyes, becoming intensely focused on the stamp she was weighing. Arthur told me what was happening. Cynthia was making the rounds, visiting old friends and neighbors, her eyes red-rimmed with crocodile tears. She told them, with heartbreaking sincerity, how my grief had unhinged me, how I'd become obsessed, paranoid, and was lashing out, blaming her for Leo's tragic accident. She played the part of the suffering widow perfectly, a poor, fragile woman being harassed and tormented by her unstable father-in-law. In a town like ours, your name, your reputation, is all you have. It's the currency you build over a lifetime of honest work and fair dealings. And Cynthia was systematically setting it on fire, turning me from Frank Miller, the guy who helped you fix your roof, into a crazy, dangerous old man. But the cruelest blow, the one that truly cut me to the bone, was aimed directly at my son's legacy. Maria called me, her voice grim and stripped of its usual confidence. Cynthia had filed a motion in court to freeze all of Leo's assets, including the very trust fund he had set up to protect his son. Her lawyer's argument was a masterpiece of calculated cruelty, that given my deteriorating mental state, I was demonstrably unfit to manage the assets on behalf of my grandson. The motion, a thick sheaf of papers Maria had emailed me, included a formal request for me to undergo a court-ordered psychiatric evaluation. I read the words on the screen, the cold legal jargon blurring together. She wasn't just trying to take everything from me, my grandson, my good name. She was trying to strip me of my legal competence, to have me declared an official burden, a man so broken he couldn't even be trusted to carry out his own son's final wishes. She wanted to erase me completely. That night, after reading those court papers, I finally broke. I went out to my workshop, the one place I'd always felt strong and capable, and just sat on my stool in the dark. The familiar smell of sawdust and varnish offered no comfort. Tonight, it smelled like failure. I looked around at the half-finished projects. A rocking horse I had started for the baby, its curved runners smooth under my calloused hand, a set of cabinets for a neighbor. My hands, which had built so much, now felt useless and empty. Everything I had constructed in my life, my family, my reputation, my role as a protector, it was all being dismantled piece by piece. For the first time, a genuine, terrifying doubt crept in, cold and sharp. Could I really win this? Cynthia was smart, she was ruthless, and she had the system, with all its biases against the elderly, seemingly on her side. All I had was a broken heart and a dead boy's journal. The fear and confusion were a physical weight, pressing down on me, suffocating me. Maybe she was right. Maybe I was just a sad old fool, too weak and lost to fight her. Right when I was at my lowest, sitting there in the echoing dark of my own failure, my phone buzzed, a faint vibration on the workbench. It was Arthur. I almost didn't answer, wanting only to be left alone in my misery. "Frank," he said, his voice steady and strong, a lighthouse in the fog. "I heard what that witch filed in court. Don't you listen to one damn word of it. We know who you are." The next morning, I heard the familiar rumble of a V8 engine and the crunch of tires on my gravel driveway. A pickup truck pulled up. It was Artie, and with him were two other guys from the old crew, Walt and Jimmy. They were all in their 60s, faces lined with the maps of long lives and hard work. They didn't say much. They just walked in with a box of donuts from the good bakery and a thermos of coffee, and sat with me in the workshop, the silence comfortable and solid between us. After a while, without a word, Walt got up and started methodically fixing the loose hinge on my back fence, the rhythmic tap, tap, tap of his hammer a reassuring beat. Jimmy popped the hood of my old John Deere mower and started tinkering with the engine, his hands moving with an easy, practiced familiarity. They didn't ask if I needed help. They just showed up and started doing the work that men do for a friend. Their quiet, steady presence was a silent testament, a physical shield against the whispers and lies. It was a message louder than any words. We believe you. We're with you. It was the strongest medicine I could have asked for. A few days after that, I was sweeping leaves off the porch when a car I didn't recognize pulled up. A woman got out. It was my son's next-door neighbor, a young mother I'd only ever nodded to. She looked nervous, twisting the strap of her purse in her hands. "Mr. Miller," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, I really don't want to get involved, but my conscience won't let me stay quiet." She told me she'd seen things, strange things. Expensive cars I didn't recognize showing up at Cynthia's house late at night, even in the weeks right after Leo died. More importantly, she told me she had heard them arguing, their angry voices carrying through the thin suburban walls, shouting about money and secrets just days before the accident. She was scared of Cynthia, but she was willing to sign an affidavit. Her testimony was the first stone cast that shattered the perfect image of the grieving widow Cynthia had so carefully crafted for the world. My lawyer, Maria, wasn't sitting still either. She was methodical, a true professional, digging where the police hadn't bothered to. She tracked down a bank officer, a man named Mr. Abernathy, who was nearing retirement himself, who had personally handled Leo's request to change his beneficiary. He remembered the meeting vividly. Young Leo seemed incredibly stressed, he told Maria, his statement recorded and notarized. He kept saying, "I need to protect my child's future just in case something happens to me." He was very specific that he did not want his wife to have direct access to the trust. This was the final nail. It proved that Leo's actions were deliberate, born of a deep and growing fear for his life. In the midst of all this, the best news I could have possibly imagined arrived. The hospital called. The baby, my grandson, was strong enough to come home. Armed with the DNA results and Maria's fierce advocacy, the court granted me temporary emergency custody. I went to the hospital, and for the very first time, I held my grandson without the barrier of plastic and the beeping of machines. I had decided to name him Hector, after my own father. A strong, solid name. I brought him home, to the house I had made safe for him. As I laid him down gently in the crib, watching his tiny chest rise and fall in the soft light of the nursery I'd set up in Leo's old room, all the doubt and fear that had plagued me simply melted away. This wasn't about my pride or my reputation anymore. It wasn't about fighting the past. It was about protecting the future, this small, perfect life sleeping right in front of me. This was my purpose now. With the new witness statements from the neighbor and the banker, the tide began to turn, slowly but surely. Detective Salazar came to my house again. This time, she didn't stand on the porch. I invited her in, and she sat at my kitchen table, a place where only friends sat. Her demeanor was completely different. The suspicion was gone, replaced by a quiet professional respect. "Mr. Miller," she said, looking directly at me, "I think we may have been too hasty in our initial assessment. We are officially reopening the investigation into your son's death." The feeling of validation was immense, not a fiery triumph, but a deep, weary relief. I wasn't the crazy old man anymore. I was a witness. The fight was far from over, I knew that. But now, for the first time, I wasn't fighting it alone. A small, persistent light was finally beginning to pierce the darkness Cynthia had pulled around all of us. The first custody hearing took place in a small, sterile courtroom that smelled faintly of lemon-scented cleaner and old paper. The air conditioning was turned up too high, humming incessantly, and a persistent chill seemed to emanate from the polished linoleum floors. It felt less like a place of justice and more like a laboratory where lives were dissected under cold, fluorescent lights. On one side of the aisle sat me, my friend Arthur, and our lawyer Maria Sanchez. Arthur wore his best suit, the one he saved for weddings and funerals, and he sat ramrod straight on the hard wooden bench, his hands resting on his knees like two hammers at rest. On the other side was Cynthia, flanked by a team of two sharp, expensive-looking lawyers in tailored suits that probably cost more than my first car. She was dressed head to toe in black, a perfect picture of a grieving widow, dabbing at her dry eyes with a silk handkerchief for the judge's benefit. It was a masterful, sickening performance. Her lead lawyer, a man with silver hair and a condescending smirk he never quite managed to hide, spent most of his time attacking me. He didn't raise his voice. He was much too clever for that. He simply painted a picture of me as a relic, a well-meaning but ultimately incapable man past his prime. He brought up my age repeatedly, letting the number hang in the air like an accusation. He presented my own medical records, obtained legally through discovery, speaking about my high blood pressure and the chronic pain in my back as if they were character flaws, as if they were incontrovertible proof of my incompetence. Every ache and pain, every prescription I took, the badges of a lifetime spent in hard physical labor, was twisted into an indictment against me. He was turning the natural process of aging into a crime, and I had to sit there in silence and take it, my hands clenched into white-knuckled fists under the table, my jaw aching from biting back the words I wanted to shout. A week later, the ordeal continued, moving from the impersonal cruelty of the courtroom to the intimate violation of my home. Mr. Davies, the young caseworker from social services, returned. This time, he brought a court-appointed psychologist with him for an official in-home assessment. She was a woman with kind eyes, but a professional distance that felt a mile wide. The two of them moved through my house with clipboards, their eyes scanning every corner, every photograph, every piece of my life. They watched me as I held Hector, observing the way I supported his head. They watched me prepare a bottle of formula, the simple act suddenly feeling like a high-stakes exam, their pens poised to record any mistake. They asked me intensely personal questions about my life, my marriage to my late wife, and the specific, gut-wrenching details of my grief for Leo. I felt like a specimen under a microscope, my life's work, my home, my very soul being picked apart and judged by strangers half my age. I've always been a private man. My home has always been my sanctuary. This invasion, this forced exposure, felt worse than any of the public accusations. It was a slow, methodical stripping away of my dignity. The one bright spot in that whole miserable process, a single moment of pure, unvarnished truth, was when Maria called Arthur to the stand as a character witness. He walked up to the witness box, his old work boots making a solid, reassuring sound on the courtroom floor. He stood tall, looking the judge squarely in the eye, his voice clear and strong, filling the quiet room. "I've known Frank Miller for more than 40 years, Your Honor," he said, his words simple and direct. "We came up in the Union together. That man has built half the houses in this town with his own 2 hands, and he did it with honesty and pride. He raised a fine son. If there is any man in this world I would trust with my own life or the life of my own child, it's Frank." His words weren't fancy. There was no legal jargon, but they were true, forged over decades of shared sweat and loyalty, and they carried the weight of a lifetime of integrity. For a moment, a real respectful silence fell over the courtroom. Even Cynthia's lawyer had the decency to look down at his notes. Meanwhile, the official police investigation that Detective Salazar had reopened was hitting a wall, a digital fortress I couldn't comprehend. She explained to me, in frustratingly simple terms, that Cynthia had been incredibly sophisticated. The bulk of Leo's life insurance payout had been wired through a series of anonymous shell corporations before landing in an offshore account in a country that didn't cooperate with U.S. law enforcement. The domestic banks, hiding behind a mountain of privacy laws, refused to release detailed transaction records without a lengthy, complicated series of warrants that Cynthia's lawyers were fighting every step of the way. I felt a profound sense of helplessness, of being an analog man in a digital war. My son's life savings, his entire legacy, was being siphoned away by a professional thief, and the very system that was supposed to protect people like him seemed designed to shield criminals like her. This new world of digital finance was a battlefield I wasn't equipped for. I was a carpenter, a man who understood wood and nails and solid foundations, not wire transfers and impenetrable firewalls. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of hearings and evaluations, the judge issued her temporary ruling. I remember holding my breath as she spoke, her voice echoing slightly in the quiet room, each word landing with immense weight. "For the immediate best interests of the child, Hector Miller," she announced, "temporary physical custody is granted to the paternal grandfather, Mr. Frank Miller." A wave of relief so intense it made me dizzy washed over me, and I felt Arthur's heavy hand clap my shoulder, but she wasn't finished. "However," she continued, her gaze stern, "this arrangement will be under the strict and regular supervision of the Department of Social Services pending further investigation." It was a victory, but a fragile and incomplete one, a victory on probation. I had won the right to keep my grandson, but I was still being watched, still considered a risk that needed to be managed. The war wasn't over. Cynthia had lost this battle, but I knew her well enough to know she wouldn't give up, not when millions of dollars were on the line. That evening, I held Hector close, his small, warm body a solid, living comfort against my chest. As long as I had him, I would keep fighting no matter what. Arthur was there for me when I needed him most. In life, sometimes it isn't our family but our old friends who truly see us and stand by us. Who's the Arthur in your life? The one who has your back no matter what? Give them a shout out in the comments. Let them know you appreciate them. A few nights after the judge's decision, the phone rang, its shrill cry shattering the dead silence of midnight. The house was completely dark, and the sudden noise felt like a physical blow. It was her again, but the syrupy sweet voice was gone, stripped away to reveal the poison underneath. This time it was pure venom, a low, menacing hiss that crawled through the phone line. "You took my son," she spat, the words sharp and cold, "but you will never see a single penny of his money." Then came the ultimatum. "There's $5 million in that trust fund, Frank. Transfer it to an account I designate, and I will disappear from your life and the kid's life forever. If you don't, I swear to you, you will never know another day of peace." This was no longer manipulation. This was a raw, blatant extortion attempt. She was trying to liquidate the very last piece of Leo's legacy, his son's future. After that call, I couldn't pretend we were safe anymore. The house I had built with my own hands, which had always been my symbol of security and peace, now felt vulnerable, its windows like dark, unblinking eyes. It needed to become a fortress. The next morning, I made another reluctant trip to the bank, withdrawing more of my retirement savings with a heavy heart. I spent it on a state-of-the-art security system, with cameras covering every angle of the property and new, heavy-duty deadbolts for all the doors. As the young technician, a polite kid who couldn't have been more than 20, drilled into the solid wood frame of my front door, wood that I had installed 40 years ago, a profound sadness settled over me. The sound of the drill was a violation. I was becoming a prisoner in my own home, living in fear of the woman my son had once loved and brought into our family for Sunday dinners. I immediately reported the extortion attempt to Detective Salazar. She listened intently, making notes, her expression hardening with each word I recounted. "This is it, Frank," she said, her voice firm, cutting through my fear. "This is the mistake we've been waiting for. She's desperate, and she's gotten sloppy. We can get her." A plan was quickly formed, a dangerous but necessary trap. I would play along. I would agree to her terms, telling her I needed to meet in person to hand over the account information. The police would be there, waiting to arrest her in the act. Salazar looked at me, her gaze serious. "Are you willing to be the bait, Frank?" she asked. I glanced over at the crib where Hector was sleeping peacefully, his tiny hand curled around the wooden slat. "I'm 68 years old. I've lived a good, full life. My greatest fear wasn't dying. It was failing in my duty, leaving my grandson in the clutches of that monster." "I am," I said, my voice steady, leaving no room for argument. The day of the meeting, time seemed to slow to a crawl, each tick of the clock in the hall a heavy thud. The police had fitted me with a tiny wire taped discreetly to the inside of my shirt collar, its presence a small, cold spot against my skin. Arthur came over early, not saying much, just sitting in my kitchen with me, a silent, solid presence to make sure I wasn't alone with my thoughts. We drank coffee and talked about old times on the job site, anything but the real reason he was there. I looked at Hector, trying to memorize every detail of his face, the curve of his cheek, the tiny tuft of dark hair. If something went wrong, I wanted this to be my last clear memory. I'm not a soldier or a hero. I'm just a grandfather trying to do the right thing. But in that moment, as I prepared to walk into danger, a strange sense of calm settled over me. The fear was still there, a low hum beneath the surface, but above it was a quiet resolve. I was ready. I met Cynthia at a quiet public park, a place where we had once held family picnics in happier times, under the shade of a massive old oak tree. The autumn air was crisp and leaves crunched under my feet. She looked different, thinner, her face drawn and tight, her eyes burning with a wild, desperate energy. "Where's the money?" she demanded. No preamble, no pretense. I handed her a plain manila envelope. As her fingers snatched it from my hand, I spoke, the words coming out clearer and stronger than I expected. It's over, Cynthia. The game is finished. She tore open the empty envelope, her face contorting with a snarl of pure rage, and for a moment her mask of control completely disintegrated. There was no grieving widow, no cold-blooded blackmailer, just a greedy, cornered animal. You have no idea, she screamed, her voice raw and ugly, echoing in the quiet park. Leo was a romantic fool. This marriage was an investment. All of it was supposed to be mine. Her confession, that blatant, hateful contempt for my son, hit me harder than any physical blow could have. In that instant, as her own words condemned her, I heard the rustle of leaves and the sound of footsteps on pavement. Detective Salazar and 2 uniformed officers emerged from behind a row of trees, their movements calm and professional, closing in. Cynthia's arrest sent a shockwave through our quiet town. The story was everywhere. The front page of the local paper, the whispers at the diner, the solemn conversations after church. With her recorded confession from the park and the undeniable, heartbreaking evidence from Leo's journal, the trial was swift. There was no room for her lies, no corner for her manipulations to hide in. The jury found her guilty on all counts: first-degree murder for what she did to my son, attempted murder for what she did to his, and extortion. The judge handed down the sentence: life in prison with no possibility of parole. I was in the courtroom that day, sitting in the back with Arthur. When I heard the verdict, I didn't feel the surge of victory I thought I would. There was no joy, no triumphant satisfaction. There was only a profound, bone-deep sense of release. It felt as if a massive, invisible weight that I had been carrying on my shoulders for months, a weight so heavy I'd forgotten what it felt like to stand straight, had finally been lifted and set down. The air in my lungs seemed to go deeper. The tense knot in my stomach, a companion for so long, finally uncoiled. Justice had been done for Leo. The fight, the relentless, all-consuming fight, was truly over. In the weeks that followed, the legal tangles that had bound up Leo's estate began to loosen and fall away. With Cynthia convicted and her claims nullified, the court officially recognized me as Hector's legal guardian, entrusting me with full control over the trust fund Leo had so bravely established. I'll never forget the day I walked into the main branch of the downtown bank, not as a person of interest or a grieving father under suspicion, but as the protector of my grandson's future. I sat across the polished mahogany desk from the bank manager, the same man who had previously treated me with a polite but firm condescension. Today, his tone was one of deep respect. We went over the investment portfolios, the financial statements, the long-term plans for Hector's education and well-being. It was a quiet, powerful moment. In signing those documents, I wasn't just managing funds. I was reclaiming something that had been stolen. I was restoring order. I had won back control, not just of my family's finances, but of my own honor and autonomy. Life began to settle into a new kind of normal, a rhythm not of crisis, but of care. The house slowly shed its identity as a fortress and began to feel like a home again. One of the first things I did was call the security company and have them remove most of the cameras. I left one over the front door, just as a precaution, but the others came down. Hearing the sound of the technician's drill, the same sound that had once filled me with such sadness, now felt like an act of liberation. Instead of the blare of the 24-hour news channel filling the house each morning, a habit I'd picked up out of anxiety, my mornings were now filled with the happy babbling of Hector, and eventually, his laughter. My workshop, once a sanctuary of solitude, was transformed. I moved all the sharp tools and dangerous chemicals to high, locked cabinets. The floor was swept clean of any stray nails or screws. In its place, I brought in a soft rubber mat and a box of wooden blocks. I even found myself at my workbench one afternoon building something I hadn't made in 30 years. A rocking horse, carved from a beautiful piece of solid oak. These small, simple acts were how I rebuilt my world, screw by screw, moment by moment, not just for me, but for us. One Saturday afternoon, I decided Hector was old enough for his first trip to the toy store. As we walked down the brightly colored aisles, I saw other kids with their mothers and fathers, young couples laughing as their toddlers made a mess of the stuffed animal display. A pang of a familiar sadness hit me, sharp and sudden. Hector would never have that. He would only know his father through my stories and the pictures on the mantelpiece. But then he let out a squeal of pure delight and pointed a chubby finger at a large, bright red toy dump truck. His eyes were wide with a joy so pure it took my breath away. I bought him that truck. On the drive home, as he sat in his car seat babbling happily to his new prized possession, I had a realization. Leo's legacy wasn't just a number in a bank account. It wasn't about the money at all. His true legacy was sitting in my back seat. It was the chance for me to give this little boy a life of safety and happiness. It was the duty and the privilege of being able to tell him, when he was old enough, about the brave, loving father who had given his own life to ensure his son would have a future. The following Sunday morning, I broke a tradition of 40 years. Instead of settling into my recliner to watch the early NFL games, I laid a blanket on the living room floor. The morning sun streamed through the windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Hector was completely absorbed, pushing his little red truck back and forth across the rug, making his own engine noises. I just sat there on the floor with him, my back against the couch, sipping my coffee and watching him. There were no courtrooms, no lawyers, no social workers, no lies. There was only peace, a simple, profound peace that felt more valuable than all the money in the world. And in that quiet moment, I understood. I hadn't just saved a child or protected a fortune. In saving Hector, I had found my own reason to live again. My role as the family patriarch, the pillar, had been restored, but in a new way, not as a provider of wealth, but as a guardian of life. And that was a job I would cherish every single day. My story, it turned out, didn't end when the courtroom gavel fell. The local paper ran a follow-up piece, a human interest story about the old carpenter who fought for his grandson. After that article was published, the letters started to arrive. Not many at first, just a few, then a dozen, then more. They were written on notebook paper, on elegant stationery, in the shaky handwriting of the elderly. They came from grandfathers and grandmothers across the state who were also raising their grandchildren alone, fighting their own quiet battles against a system that wasn't built for them. They came from fathers and mothers, my own age, terrified that the nest egg they had worked their whole lives to build would be squandered or stolen by their own children. I realized my story wasn't just my own, my pain, my fight. It was their fight too. They were the silent majority. People who either didn't have a voice or were too afraid, too tired to use it. And somehow, I, Frank Miller, a retired carpenter, had been given a platform. A local community center invited me to speak at a senior outreach event. My first instinct was to say no. I hesitated for a full week. I'm not a public speaker. I'm a man who is more comfortable with a hammer in his hand than a microphone. My whole life has been about doing, not talking. But then I looked at Hector, and I knew I had to. I stood in front of a room full of people my own age, their faces lined with the same worries and hopes as my own. I didn't use notes. I didn't try to sound like a politician or a lawyer. I just told my story. I didn't talk about complex legal statutes or financial instruments. I talked about what it felt like to be dismissed because of your age. I talked about the fear of seeing your life's work, everything you built for your family, threatened. I talked about the love a man has for his son and for his son's son. When I finished, there was a moment of silence, and then the whole room got to their feet and applauded. They weren't clapping for a hero. They were clapping because they saw themselves in my story. They were clapping for the validation of their own silent struggles. From that one talk, an idea began to grow. I talked with Arthur and a few of the other guys from the union. We met in my workshop over coffee and donuts, just like we always did. We decided to start a small, informal support group. We called it the Legacy Guard. Our goal was simple: to create a safe place where older folks could share their stories without being judged, get trusted advice on legal and financial planning from professionals we vetted, and most importantly, to know they weren't alone in their fight. We weren't a team of experts, but we had something just as valuable: a lifetime of experience. Every now and then, I still take out Leo's little black journal. I don't read it to dwell on the pain of the past. I read it to remember his courage. My son, in the final terrifying days of his life, did not surrender to fear. He took action. He did what a man does. He protected what he loved. That journal is no longer just evidence of a crime. It has become a testament to a father's love and a man's responsibility. That is the true inheritance he left for me and for Hector. A lesson that even when you are facing the deepest darkness, one small act of foresight, one small act of love can change everything. People say that builders like me, we just put up walls, but I've learned over the course of a long life that we build much more than that. We build homes, the places where families grow and memories are made. We build foundations so that the next generation has something solid to stand on. A man's legacy isn't the money he leaves behind in an account. It's in the things he builds, the things he protects, the lives he touches. I've protected my legacy. It isn't sitting in a bank vault. It's running through the sprinklers in the backyard, laughing, holding a little red dump truck. His name is Hector. And our story, the one we build together every day, is just beginning. Thank you for listening.